Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I'm Deepak, your host from India. We are honored to welcome Dr. Anthony Chemero as our distinguished guest on Business Talk today. Before we get started, I would like to introduce today's guest. Dr. Anthony Chemero is not content to work on just one side of the philosophy-science divide. His instincts on standing squarely in the middle of it. University Distinguished Research Professor of Philosophy and Psychology at the University of Cincinnati. Dr. Anthony earned his PhD in Philosophy and Cognitive Science from Indiana University in 1999, following a Bachelor's in Philosophy from Tufts University. After more than a decade shaping minds at Franklin and Marshall College, he joined University of Cincinnati in 2012, where he has since built a research program that refuses easy categorization. His work orbits some of the most generative edges of contemporary cognitive science: nonlinear dynamical modeling, ecological psychology, complex systems, phenomenology, and social cognition, always asking what it truly means for a mind to be embodied in the world. He is a primary member of both UC's Center for Cognition, Action, and Perception and the Strange Tools Research Lab, two homes that fuse his boundary crossing sensibility perfectly. Dr. Anthony is the author of over 100 scholarly articles and two widely taught books: Radical Embodied Cognitive Science, a Lakatos Prize finalist, and Phenomenology, co-authored with Dr. Stephanie Koifer. His book Intertwined, The Embodied Cognitive Science of Self and Other Promises to push that inquiry further into the social and relational dimensions of mind. His contributions have earned him the University Distinguished Research Award, the Latino Faculty Association Excellence in Research Award, and the Reversal Award for Scholarly Achievement at the University of Cincinnati. Recognition that his philosophical empirical gamble is paying off. In today's episode, Dr. Anthony joins us to explore the core ideas from his acclaimed book, Intertwined Creatures, the Embodied Cognitive Science of Self and Other. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Anthony Chemero to the conversation. Professor Anthony, it is a distinct privilege to welcome you to Business Talk. We are grateful for you to accepting our invitation.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Professor, the dominant picture of the mind in Western philosophy, hidden, internal, isolated, has shaped everything from our legal systems to how we raise children. What was the moment you realized this picture was not just philosophically wrong, but consequently wrong?
So I think the realization that it wasn't at least wasn't the whole story came when I was in undergraduate and talking with Daniel Dennett, who was my undergraduate advisor, and Dan would point out that all of the kind of skeptical arguments that philosophers make um, depend upon a very weird sort of interaction, and he just said, imagine having the conversation with your romantic partner or your mother saying, hey, for all I know, actually, you don't have anything going on the inside. Um, you're not really having experiences. You're just a machine that acts like you have those experiences. I mean, that would be very offensive. I mean, we would never do it to someone that we cared about. Um, and that leads you to kind of question, like, well, what can we do it to people we don't care about as well? The possibility that your mind is hidden from me um, leads to a kind of alienation from not just from individual others, but all others. And back then, I was becoming more and more convinced that this wasn't a small problem with the cognitive sciences. This was a big problem.
Professor, journey from analytic philosophy to feminist theory and embodied cognitive science is not a typical one. How did feminist political theory crack open your thinking about what a person actually is? And why don't more cognitive scientists take the tradition seriously?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when I was in graduate school, my PhD advisor, Brian Cantwell Smith, who recently passed, and I had a conversation where we were lamenting the fact that, well, we're doing this relatively meaningless philosophy of AI and cognitive science, when the real philosophical import is with feminist theory. Because we're in a situation and they make good arguments that half the population is dramatically disadvantaged by the way we've set up our cultures. And Brian and I were lamenting, like, why can't we participate in that? Um, and I suppose it just took me 25 years to figure out how how I could say something that's relevant to feminist political theory, to moral philosophy, um, and again, really just following up on the insights of feminist thinkers from the end of the last century.
Professors argue that our earliest experiences as newborns are fundamentally shared, not isolated. Can you unpack that? And what does infant experience tell us about the default architecture of the self that we tend to forget as adults?
Good. So all of you, right? Everyone listening, that is, spent the first months of awareness inside another human. And your experiences then, and you were having experiences, were all co-experiences. And once you're born, you're completely helpless. And among your first experiences are understanding yourself as the object of someone's attention and their experience with a close caregiver. Um, and I think that that sets up a kind of way of being, and a self that is not walled off from the environment and from other people. There's a kind of porousness between our experiences and those of others, such that, again, going back to the first question, we couldn't even really seriously ask the question about whether the people around us are all machines or without experiences. That just doesn't make any sense if you start from the idea that everybody's initial experiences, their developmentally foundational experiences, are experiences with another person. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a kind of isolable, separate self. Um, I can right now have thoughts that you don't know about, but that's a kind of rare distance case from this initial base case of being with others.
Professor Cartesian dualism has been declared dead many times, yet it keeps returning in disguise in AI design, in how we think about mental health, even in political philosophy. Why is the isolated mind myth so stubbornly resilient, and what does it take to truly dislodge it?
I wish I knew what it would take to dislodge the idea. It's foundational in lots of Western cultures and Christianity. And during the Enlightenment, the initial scientific revolution, it became installed as the kind of default, and it really has persisted as that. The idea of a mind separated from an environment. Those are the two things that philosophy has to be about. How does the mind know about the environment? Um, so it's built in deep. It's built deeply into us. Um, Now there have always been dissenters, and in the book I talk about Martin Heidegger and Maurice Merleau-Ponty, phenomenological philosophers, but also a bunch of pragmatist philosophers from the early 20th century who have always kind of questioned this mind in here, world out there conception. And really, cognitive science, which as you mentioned, is my discipline, was founded on a reintroduction of this idea of the mind as super isolated from the environment. That's the kind of foundation of artificial intelligence and cognitive science from the 1950s. Um, and the 20th century up until then had been a kind of series of arguments against the idea that the mind is internal and isolated. So it's not just built deeply into Western culture, it's also built deeply into artificial intelligence and cognitive science. And the idea right from the beginning is that, the real thinking, the real you is done on an invisible to others processor. And you only from there have very low bandwidth connections to the environment, say via a keyboard, or in human case, the senses. So the idea that the thing that's doing the real thinking is distant from the environment is deeply built not just into our culture but into our sciences. Um, and I I would love to dislodge it, but I think that what I can hope to do is make people realize that it's not obvious that I am in here and invisible and the rest of the world is opaque to me, other than a very small bandwidth of connection that I can have.
Professor, terms like nonlinear dynamical modeling and far from equilibrium thermodynamics can sound intimidating. You use examples like flushing toilets and catching frisbee to explain self-organization. How do those everyday examples illuminate what happens when minds and environments couple together?
So that these are intimidating concepts. They come from kind of 20th, mid 20th century and later physics. Um, and in the book, I push all of the mathematics that is used to make sense of these in the sciences into an appendix. But the real idea is not very complicated. And that's why I like to talk about toilets. Also, because I'm talking about cognitive science, and that means I'm saying that you're in many ways like a toilet. Um, but the idea is that look, when you flush the toilet, this like nice whirlpool forms, especially if you have an old toilet. And that whirlpool isn't the result of some water molecule saying, "Hey, everyone, let's spin around like this." Right? It's just that because of the energy that's released when you flush the toilet, um, an organization occurs that is actually the fastest way to dissipate the energy difference between the water in the tank and the water going down the drain. Um, and so in order to kind of get rid of energy excess, the universe is built so that organization forms, and organizations form because they get rid of differences between things faster. Um, and the thing is, the phrase that people use to talk about self-organized systems is synergies, which comes from far from equilibrium thermodynamics, and is different from the way business people would talk about synergy. A synergy is a collection of things constrained typically by an energy gradient to behave as a coherent unit. Um, and it's very clear that our individual cells are synergies, our organs are synergies, our brains are synergies. And the also, right from the beginning, people were able to show that pairs of interacting humans also are synergies. Um, so this one kind of concept that seems to apply at all levels where there is self-organization um, does most of the explanatory work in the complexity sciences. And this is hard for people to see, especially if they're raised in a kind of Western philosophical tradition, because kind of this implies that there's a kind of causation that goes from the system as a whole to the parts of the system that compose it, right? So there's interscale causation, which is supposedly impossible according to most philosophical views. But despite the fact that it's supposedly impossible to most philosophical views, it's just all around us. All of nature seems to work like this, um, where you have macro systems that are composed of things but simultaneously constraining the activity of those things.
Professor, you use the image of two people carrying a sofa together as a window into joint action and shared cognition. What is happening cognitively and physically in that moment that standard individual mind accounts simply cannot explain?
So I wouldn't want to say that standard individual mind accounts can't make sense of it. There are plenty of people doing joint action research that assume a kind of individualism. Um, but the idea of a kind of system coming together temporarily, like like the flushing toilet, that constrains the dynamics of the people that are involved in it. I mean, I think that that's a compelling way to kind of naturalize this phenomena. It's not so that okay, we're carrying a sofa together. I have to kind of simultaneously build an internal model of the forces on my arms and legs when I'm doing this, and a model of your mind in order to solve this problem. Instead, we just kind of both pick up the couch and let it kind of constrain our activities so that we get it up the stairs. But I don't think that it's impossible for standard cognitive science approaches to make sense of this. It just requires a whole bunch of kind of cognitive machinery that we don't need if we just talk about the system as a whole. Yeah, I'll stop there. I could go on and on and on about this.
Professor, one of your more radical claims is that emotions and moods can be collective. That the feeling in a room, an argument, or a political moment is not just the sum of individual inner states. How do you defend that claim empirically? And what does it mean for how we understand mental health?
Mental health. Okay, so empirically, the idea would be to kind of demonstrate that interacting humans have the same kind of dynamics as an individual brain and as cells that make up the brain, and presumably as like the whole culture has, right? So once you start kind of pressing out from the individual into broader things, things like collective emotions start to seem obviously required to make sense of how we interact with things. So we can talk about the electorate being angry about gas prices. And it's not just because if we add up the relative amount of anger amongst individuals, you have this kind of, oh, it's above average. The average anger is above average. No, there's a kind of way in which the parts that the components, which is to say the people that form the electorate, interact with one another in order to make the anger increase. So this kind of anger is shared. It's not just mine. It's not just yours. It's not just my neighbors. We're all participating in this kind of general public mood. Um, this is not a new idea. It goes back to the early 20th century when people would talk just cheerfully and routinely about collective minds. And also, the philosopher Martin Heidegger, who I mentioned earlier, would talk about how moods are kind of by definition public, right? I can't be in a mood by myself. The whole a collection of people has to kind of support and be in that mood.
Professor, you specifically frame this book as urgent in the age of AI. Current AI systems are arguably built on exactly the isolated input-output model of mind you reject. What would an AI design around intervened, embodied cognition actually look like? And are we anywhere near building it?
Good. So people immediately will talk about whenever I talk about, well, really like embodiment and sociality are really central to the kinds of minds that we have. They'll say right away, well, why don't we just put a large language model in a robot? And I don't think that that doesn't solve the problem at all. And frankly, I don't think it's a problem we want to solve, right? Because if we make machines too much like us so that they are living things that are connected to the other people and are necessarily in bodies and, necessarily having emotions, suddenly they seem not like the things we can just use as tools, right? They seem to demand a kind of moral respect. So AI researchers, stop. Stop trying to build AIs that are too much like living things like humans, because when we build them, we can't use them as tools anymore.
Professor, if the self is genuinely constituted by its relationships, environment, and social context, That has radical implications for how we assign moral responsibility, design public policy, or think about individual freedom. Where do you see the most urgent political consequences of your argument?
Good. So the first thing I would say is that if these early life experiences, these kind of close caregiver experiences are foundational and that we always with us as a way of being, I think that the first thing is to kind of genuinely support parents and newborns so that so that children have more individual experiences with other people who are kind of there to teach them. And daycare is great, but it's not the same as sitting on mom's lap when you are doing something or being carried around by your parents. So that's the first thing is I think we need to kind of make it so that people can, once they have a baby, can spend time with that baby for a period without losing their jobs, without any financial penalties, just kind of parental leave. And many, maybe most countries around the world have some kind of paid parental leave policy, and the US doesn't. So that's the first thing I would say to my neighbors is, hey, we need to kind of support parenting right away. And if we support parenting right away, that automatically means we're supporting mothers, right? And that's kind of a push in the direction of equalizing our system so that being a woman is not a disadvantage in it.
Professor, before we wrap up, one final question. Every serious book opens as many doors as it closes. What is the question that Intertwined Creatures raises but does not fully answer? The one that is keeping you up at night and likely driving your next project.
Yeah, my next project is going to be a response to the way people respond to claims of embodiment, especially in AI. The one example in a recent high-profile publication is, look, embodiment doesn't really matter because look, Stephen Hawking was so smart. He had a perfectly well-functioning, even super high-functioning mind. So embodiment must not matter to mind. Um, and that seems like deeply wrong to me in every way, and not just wrong to me in a kind of conceptual philosophical way, but also a moral way, right? Because it's not as if Stephen Hawking didn't have a body and didn't like interact with his environment. Of course he did. It's just different from ours, from those of us who are able to walk and talk more easily than he was capable of late in his life. So so the current book is to kind of dig deep into what it means to be embodied and with a kind of constant eye to how we think about and try to build new AI systems. Um, and I feel like there's a kind of deep urgency here because of the environmental impact of AI. Um, and not just is it going to poison the world for next generations, but it's for people now who are trying to raise families, who are struggling to kind of live in our world. It's dramatically increasing the price of their energy. So I think that understanding the kind of deepness of our embodiment, I hope will lead us to rethink some of the things that we're doing in order to kind of build these artificial things that pollute a ton and steal people's work and make lots of mistakes still. I feel like, if we could set that aside, at least in part, as a goal for our culture, one, I think it would be better for humans, and I think it's actually what most humans want. Secondly, it's that I think that most humans don't want AI doing all their work for us. I often tell my students, you don't go to the gym and have a robot lift the weights for you, right? Because the point is that you're learning and the lifting of the weights is ultimately good for you. And the same is true with the assignments that your teachers give you. They're designed to kind of improve you in some way. And I want to kind of point us back toward that and away from spending all of our mental and technological and economic energy on building these machines that aren't like us.
Professor Anthony, you have given us a lot to sit with today, and perhaps that's the most fitting takeaway from a book about intervened minds that the best ideas don't stay neatly inside our heads. They spill out, travel between people, and change shape in the exchange. Thank you for sharing your time, fascinating publication research with us today. This has been a truly enlightening. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you. This has been really enjoyable, and thank you for inviting me on the show.